The sun sets over the camp, casting long shadows across the desert. Families settle in for the evening, unaware that within moments, their world will be torn apart. The sounds of laughter, the crackle of fires, the quiet murmurs of conversation, these will soon be drowned out by the screams of the dying. A sudden piercing cry cuts through the air, then another. Chaos erupts as men wielding swords descend upon their own people. The first victims fall where they stand, their bodies crumpling into the sand, lifeless before they even realize what's happening. Others scramble for shelter only to be dragged out and cut down without mercy. The killers are methodical, relentless. They do not spare the elderly, the women, or even the children. These attackers are not foreign invaders, not enemy soldiers sent to wipe out their nation. They are not pagans, heretics, or rival tribes seeking revenge. These killers are their own kin, brothers turning against brothers, fathers slaughtering their sons. And the man who ordered it all? He is not some tyrannical warlord, not a bloodthirsty conqueror, not a dictator carving out an empire. He is Moses. This is the Levite massacre, one of the most disturbing and overlooked events in the Bible. A massacre not of outsiders or enemies, but of fellow Israelites. The slaughter was not done in the name of conquest, not as an act of war, but as punishment for what Moses considered an act of betrayal. And yet, despite the sheer brutality of this event, Moses remains a revered figure, a prophet, a hero, a man of God. Why is this mass killing, an act that would be condemned as genocide today, excused, justified, and even celebrated as an example of divine justice? How is it that the same people who recoil in horror at modern atrocities turn a blind eye when similar acts are committed in the pages of their holy book? And more importantly, what does this reveal about the true nature of the Bible, its God, and the morality it promotes? This massacre, ordered by Moses, forces us to confront some unsettling questions. If a modern religious leader ordered his followers to slaughter non-believers, he would be condemned worldwide. If a government commanded the execution of thousands for worshiping the wrong God, it would be considered a crime against humanity. But when Moses does it, it is framed as obedience to God. This double standard is worth examining, because if we strip away the religious framing, if we view this event as it truly is, cold, calculated mass murder, it begins to look eerily familiar. History is filled with figures who have justified unspeakable violence in the name of purity, ideology, or faith, and Moses fits the pattern perfectly. But before we dissect the justification, the theology, and the historical implications, we need to lay out the facts. What exactly happened during the Levite massacre? What led to this moment of bloodshed? And what does it tell us about the origins of the God of the Bible? The answers to these questions might change everything you thought you knew about Moses, about the Bible, and about the morality it claims to uphold. Moses had just descended from Mount Sinai, where he had spent 40 days and nights receiving what would become the foundation of Jewish law, the Ten Commandments. Engraved in stone, these divine laws were supposed to guide the Israelites toward a righteous, moral life. Among them, one commandment stood out: "Thou shalt not kill." But Moses' return was not met with reverence or celebration. What he saw enraged him. While he was gone, the Israelites, his own people, had built and worshipped a golden calf. To Moses, this was the ultimate betrayal. After everything they had been through, after all the miracles they had witnessed, they had abandoned their faith in Yahweh and reverted to idol worship. Moses' fury was immediate and violent. In his rage, he shattered the stone tablets, the very laws he had just received. He burned the golden calf, ground it into dust, mixed it into water, and forced the Israelites to drink it, a symbolic punishment meant to humiliate and purify them. But humiliation wasn't enough. Moses wanted blood. He turned to the Levites, his own tribe, and commanded them to take up their swords. Without hesitation, they obeyed. What followed was nothing short of a massacre. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, "Each of you put your sword on your side, go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill your brother, your friend, and your neighbor." Exodus 32:27. The Levites moved through the camp, slaughtering anyone they deemed guilty. They did not ask questions. They did not differentiate between the ringleaders and the bystanders. The command was clear: kill indiscriminately. By the time the bloodshed ended, 3,000 Israelites lay dead. Fathers had killed their sons. Friends had murdered friends. The community had torn itself apart. And Moses' response? He praised the Levites for their obedience. For their willingness to kill their own people, he blessed them, saying they had been set apart for service to Yahweh. This moment is one of the most jarring contradictions in the entire Bible. The same Moses who had just received the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," had now ordered the execution of thousands. The same God who had supposedly delivered his people from slavery had now demanded their extermination. The same faith that preached mercy and love had now justified fratricide. This event raises deeply troubling questions. If idolatry was such a terrible sin, why was murder the appropriate response? And if Moses was a prophet of a just and moral God, why would he order such brutality? The hypocrisy is glaring. If free will is truly a gift from God, why were the Israelites not simply allowed to repent? Why was their only choice death? And perhaps most unsettling, if this act had been committed by anyone else, if it had been ordered by a leader in any other context, would we excuse it? Would we celebrate if a modern religious leader gathered his followers and commanded them to slaughter those who did not believe correctly? We would call it terrorism. If a government ordered mass executions for worshiping the wrong God, we would call it genocide. And yet, in the Bible, this is called righteousness. The mental gymnastics required to justify this act are staggering. Some Christians will often argue that the Israelites deserved their fate because they broke their covenant with Yahweh. But this logic implies that religious disobedience is a crime punishable by death, a dangerous and totalitarian mindset that has justified countless atrocities throughout history. Others claim that this massacre was necessary to purify Israel, to prevent them from straying again. But at what cost? The Levites didn't just kill guilty individuals. They slaughtered their own brothers, friends, and neighbors. This was not a simple act of discipline. This was a purge, a religious cleansing. If this is divine justice, then what separates Yahweh from the vengeful, bloodthirsty gods of other ancient religions? What makes Moses different from the warlords of his time? And why should we accept this as a moral example? The Levite massacre was more than just a punishment for idolatry. It was a turning point. This was the moment that solidified Moses' authority. By leading the Levites to slaughter their own people, he ensured their loyalty. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Once they had killed their own kin in the name of Yahweh, they could not turn back. They were bound to Moses, bound to his leadership, bound to his vision of religious purity. The Levites, from that moment forward, became the priestly class of Israel. They were rewarded for their violence with power, granted control over religious law and rituals. Their willingness to kill on command was seen not as a moral failing, but as proof of their devotion. And the rest of Israel? They learned a valuable lesson. Obedience was not optional. Questioning authority, stepping out of line, worshiping the wrong God, or even hesitating in faith could mean death. The Levite massacre was a warning, a clear and bloody message that Yahweh's laws were to be followed without question. But this event was not an isolated incident. This was just the beginning of a long pattern of religious violence in the Bible. And as we will see, the God of Moses was not unique. He was not a radical departure from the warlike deities of the ancient world. He was molded in their image. Before the Israelites called Yahweh their one true God, before Moses led his people through the wilderness, and long before the Levite massacre became part of biblical history, the region of Canaan was teeming with gods. Gods of war, gods of storms, gods of fertility, and gods who demanded blood. Yahweh was not born in a vacuum. He was one of many. And his evolution into the sole deity of Israel is a story of war, conquest, and brutal divine justice. To understand the massacre Moses commanded, we have to place it in its proper historical and religious context. The God of the Old Testament did not emerge from a tradition of peace and morality. He emerged from a world where gods were warlords, where devotion was proven through sacrifice, and where power was established through bloodshed. Before Yahweh was worshipped as the singular God of Israel, he was likely a regional deity, one among many worshipped by the early Semitic tribes. Scholars point to evidence that Yahweh was originally a warrior god, much like the Canaanite Baal, the Moabite Chemosh, and the Ammonite Molech. These deities all had one thing in common. They were associated with violence, conquest, and destruction. Baal, the storm god, was seen as a divine warrior who defeated the forces of chaos. Chemosh, the god of Moab, was worshipped through war and human sacrifice. Molech, perhaps the most infamous of them all, demanded that children be burned as offerings in his name. And then there was Yahweh. Early inscriptions in biblical texts suggest that Yahweh was originally a god of storms and war, much like Baal. In fact, some evidence suggests that Yahweh may have originally been worshipped as a consort to the Canaanite goddess Asherah, but later traditions erased this association in favor of strict monotheism. The Yahweh of Moses' time was not a gentle God of love and forgiveness. He was a God of wrath, a deity who rewarded obedience with protection and punished defiance with destruction. The Levite massacre fits perfectly within this ancient religious framework. Gods of this era demanded proof of loyalty, often in blood, and Yahweh, as depicted in the Old Testament, was no different. The slaughter of the Israelites who worshipped the golden calf was not just an act of punishment. It was an act of devotion, a ritualistic blood offering to cement Yahweh's dominance over his people. This was not the first time nor the last that Yahweh would demand mass killings. Throughout the Old Testament, we see similar patterns. When Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan, Yahweh commanded him to slaughter entire cities, men, women, children, even animals, to purify the land. When Saul failed to completely wipe out the Amalekites, Yahweh rejected him as king. His crime? Not being thorough enough in genocide. When Israel turned away from Yahweh, Moses' actions mirror those of ancient warlords who used religious justification to cement their rule. He did not just claim political leadership over Israel, he claimed divine authority. His massacres were not just acts of anger, they were part of a larger pattern of religious control. By commanding the Levites to kill their own people, Moses ensured that Yahweh's worship would be absolute. There would be no rival gods, no questioning of divine authority, no tolerance for deviation. Those who strayed would die, and those who followed would be rewarded. This is not the behavior of a benevolent deity. This is the behavior of a war god, a god who, like his Canaanite counterparts, thrived on blood sacrifice and demanded obedience through terror. One of the greatest arguments for biblical faith is that Yahweh is unique, that he is different from the pagan gods who demanded violence and cruelty. But when we look at the evidence, when we compare Yahweh to the deities of the time, we see the truth. Yahweh was not different. He was not an exception. He was part of the same brutal religious tradition that justified war, massacre, and blood sacrifice. If Yahweh were truly a moral God, if he were truly above the violent, primitive deities of the past, then why do his actions mirror theirs so closely? Why does he command the same purges, the same genocides, the same violent retribution? And more importantly, if people today reject Baal, Molech, and Chemosh as cruel and barbaric, then why do they worship Yahweh? Moses was not just a prophet, he was a warlord, a leader who used divine authority to justify mass murder. And Yahweh was not just a god, he was a relic of a time when faith was built on fear, when devotion was proven through blood, and when religious leaders held power through violence. The Levite massacre was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that stretches throughout the Bible, throughout history, and into the very foundations of religious control. And it raises a question that many are too afraid to ask. If the God of the Bible is no different from the war gods of the ancient world, then what does that say about the faith that worships him? History is filled with men who committed mass murder in the name of ideology, power, or religious purity. Leaders like Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot are universally condemned for their atrocities, their ruthless purges, and their ability to manipulate people into committing heinous acts. But when Moses does the same thing, ordering the slaughter of thousands under the pretense of divine command, he is revered as a prophet, a hero of faith, and a righteous leader. Why the double standard? Why do people recoil in horror at the mention of Hitler's genocide but see Moses' massacres as justified acts of divine justice? Why is religious violence in the past excused, while similar acts today are met with universal condemnation? This is where the psychology of religious violence comes into play. The terrifying power of divine justification, and the reality that Moses' actions were no different from those of the most infamous killers in human history. Throughout history, some of the most brutal massacres were justified through religious belief. When a leader convinces his followers that the killings they commit are righteous, that their victims are wicked, and that they are carrying out the will of a higher power, the usual barriers to violence disappear. Moses did not simply order a massacre. He framed it as an act of divine purification. The Levites, his personal enforcers, were convinced that they were doing God's work. And once that idea takes hold, there are no limits to the horrors people will commit. Compare this to modern atrocities. Hitler's Holocaust was framed as a mission to purify the world, targeting those deemed enemies of the state. Stalin's purges were justified as necessary for ideological purity, branding dissenters as threats to the revolution. The Jonestown Massacre happened because Jim Jones convinced his followers that their mass suicide was an act of faith, necessary to escape their enemies. Islamic extremist groups justify mass killings through religious doctrine, believing their violence is divinely sanctioned. Moses' massacre fits neatly into this pattern. He instilled the belief that those who worshiped the golden calf were corrupt, deserving of death. The Levites carried out the killings with zeal, believing they were purifying Israel. This is how religious violence works. It turns murder into a moral act. If a modern religious leader ordered his followers to slaughter thousands in the name of faith, he would be called a terrorist. If a politician did it, he would be called a dictator. If a cult leader did it, he would be called insane. But because it's Moses, it's righteous. Why do people worship a man who, by today's standards, would be viewed as a religious extremist, a war criminal, and a dictator? The answer is simple: indoctrination and historical distance. People grow up hearing stories of Moses as a hero, a lawgiver, a man of God. His actions are framed as necessary, righteous, even merciful. By the time they are old enough to question, the belief is already deeply ingrained. But when you strip away the religious framing, when you remove the divine justification, Moses' actions become clear for what they truly are: acts of mass murder carried out in the name of power. Imagine for a moment that Moses lived today, in the modern world. Imagine that a self-proclaimed prophet, claiming divine authority, ordered his most devoted followers to massacre 3,000 people because they worshipped differently. How would the world react? Would he be seen as righteous? Or would he be hunted down as a terrorist, a criminal, a genocidal madman? The truth is, the same people who defend Moses would condemn anyone who followed in his footsteps today. They would call his actions evil, monstrous, unjustifiable, but because Moses is an ancient figure wrapped in the language of Scripture, people accept what they would never tolerate in the present. This is the danger of religious double standards. It allows atrocities to be excused when they are framed in the right context. It turns mass murder into a holy act. It allows people to worship a man who, if he lived today, would be one of history's most notorious killers. Moses' massacre was not just about punishment, it was about control. Like all cult leaders, he needed absolute obedience. The Levite massacre was a message to his followers: defy me, and you die. This is the same strategy used by history's worst tyrants. Kill a portion of the population and the rest will fall in line. Instill fear, and no one will dare question your authority. Moses was not a gentle prophet. He was a ruler who solidified his power through terror, just like the dictators and warlords who came after him. And yet, people still believe he was chosen by God. The Levite massacre is not just an ancient story. It is a warning. It shows how easily faith can be used to justify the unjustifiable. It exposes the danger of elevating religious figures beyond moral scrutiny. And it forces an uncomfortable question: if we reject genocide today, why do we accept it in the Bible? If Moses' actions were moral, then morality itself has no meaning. If his massacre was righteous, then righteousness is just a word for religious violence. And if we wouldn't accept a modern leader who behaved like Moses, then why do billions still worship him? Religious history is full of events that, when examined without the lens of faith, reveal unsettling patterns of control, violence, and manipulation. The Levite massacre was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger trend within the Bible, one where mass killings were justified as divine will, where genocide was framed as obedience, and where leaders like Moses operated in ways eerily similar to the cult figures and tyrants of later history.